One morning, Sir Topham Hatt was observing Edward in the yard. He seemed to be struggling with the trucks, which was quite unusual. He went to investigate. Edward saw him approaching and tried to greet him. "Edward, I'm concerned. What seems to be the matter?" "Oh, sir, I feel dreadful. My wheels are wobbly, I can hardly make steam, and I make a horrible clanking sound." "Well, that just won't do," said Sir Topham Hatt. "Edward, I'm sending you to the works to have your worn parts mended." Edward smiled. "Oh, thank you, sir. It'll be lovely not to clank." It's hard to believe that it's been 6 years since I started modeling in G-scale. What started as me rediscovering my childhood toys has evolved into one of my favorite pastimes. I've made so many unique models since starting this hobby, and they keep getting better as I learn new things. Although, as the new models get better, the old ones tend to look worse in comparison. So, over the past few months, I've been making efforts to improve my older custom models. Origins James was first, followed by the LBSC Thomas. Both engines got a new coat of paint, with Thomas's in particular being more accurate to his on-screen appearance. I replaced their terrible decals with proper ones made for my Cricket, and I made other small fixes where necessary. And with these two finished, the next model to tackle was Edward. While Thomas and James are technically my first customs, I consider Edward to be my first real custom. Thomas and James were pretty simple repaints with not a lot changed from the base models, but Edward was a massive undertaking requiring me to cut large amounts of plastic, fill in sand holes, rewire electronics, and cast duplicate parts, all skills I had never attempted prior. Now, I'm profoundly proud of what I was able to accomplish. Considering my skill level, the fact that I was able to complete a working model was a miracle. But having learned so much more since then, its flaws have become that much more apparent, and an upgrade was very much necessary. There were 4 key areas I wanted to address with Edward's upgrade: his front bogie, his side rods, his face, and his paint. His bogie was made of 2 of James's bogies glued together, and while they admittedly held together, for durability I would have preferred if the bogie was a single piece. His side rods were cast of a shortened side rod that I made. This was my first time casting an object, and the result was rather rough and imperfect. The face is probably the worst part of the model, and the comments on the original video made that very clear. It was also made through casting, and I went through several attempts before landing on this one. Truthfully, the only reason I even settled on the face was because it had the best interface points for the iMac. I don't actually have too much of a problem with the paint job. It's just a little sloppy on account of my inexperience and could use a touch-up. I started the upgrades around the time I was working on my Percy, and using what I'd learned from him, I was able to design and print new parts for Edward. A single piece double bogie, a shortened side rod, and a face more accurately based on the Tomy model. The next step would have been to redo his paint job, but before getting to that, I remembered an issue I brought up in the original video: his incorrect firebox. Now, I did a lot to transform the Lionel James into Edward, but the one thing I couldn't do was change the firebox. This would have required me to replace the entire boiler and somehow fabricate a new one with the correct shape and dimensions, something that was well out of my skill set at the time. But now it's 6 years later, and I do have the skills thanks to my 3D printer. I could easily design a brand new boiler with the correct firebox and print it out. Although, this would require me to alter other aspects of the model. The cab would need to be modified to account for the smaller firebox, and the screw holes in the running board and chassis would have to be repositioned to line up with both the cab and the boiler. This ultimately led me to recreate the model almost entirely with 3D printed parts, resulting in Lionel Edward 2.0. This was really the best way to go about remaking the model. For the longest time, I'd been wanting to move away from modifying Lionel models and start making customs from the ground up. This would give me more freedom when designing models and allow me to add details I couldn't before. I wasn't working completely from scratch. I'm currently in the midst of recreating the Lionel Thomas and James, and a lot of James's parts for the project were modified to work for Edward. And fortunately, the upgrades for version 1 didn't go to waste, as I was able to reuse those assets for this project. The part I'm most proud of is the custom chassis. Up to now, I've been working around Thomas and James's chassis, trying to adapt them to fit the specific character I'm working on for better or for worse. But with Edward version 2, I was able to design a chassis that accurately matched his wheel configuration and housed the necessary electronics. This is a big step for future models, as I can now tailor-make chassis for specific engines. While most of the model is custom built, there were some parts reused out of convenience, such as the eye mechanism, the wheels, and the coal load. Version 2 is more or less a cleaned up version of the original, but aside from the difference in quality, there are a couple things I did change between the old and new models. I already mentioned the firebox, changing that to match Edward's slimmer profile, and that in turn changed the cutout in the cab. The smoke box was updated to add this sloped part at the front. Previously that was part of the running board on the original model, but was changed for the convenience of printing. I also changed the spacing of his buffers. The Lionel James strangely has its buffers spaced 51mm apart, whereas Thomas's buffers are 65mm apart. This is also the spacing for Annie and Clarabelle, as well as my Percy and Toby. Since the original Edward used parts from James, he naturally adopted his spacing, but in order to keep things unified across my models, I decided to adjust Edward's buffers to the more common spacing. This project also saw me change the type of filament I use for 3D printing. Up to this point, I've been using PLA, which is the most basic type of filament available. There's nothing inherently wrong with PLA, it's cheap, easy to use, and really strong when used right. But when I took my Lionel Percy out for its first run, part of the model started to warp in the heat. So for this project, I switched to ABS, a slightly more durable plastic that most toys you find are made of. ABS has a higher heat resistance than PLA, so hopefully we should avoid any more incidents like that. Moving forward, all my models will be printed with ABS, and any model currently made with PLA will eventually be reprinted. Something that you may have noticed is the absence of boiler lining. While I have lined other parts of the model like his cab windows, I decided not to line his boiler. It was recommended to me on Patreon to forego painting the boiler to look more like a Lionel model. I thought about it, and yeah, the Lionel, Thomas, and James don't have any boiler lining, so leaving it off of Edward would be more accurate. The lining on the original was really crucial to identify the model as Edward, since it wasn't really that detailed, but version 2 is just as recognizable without it. The last change I made was giving Edward a set of custom face masks in the same vein as Thomas and James. And while I didn't make Edward a box like I did for Percy, I did put together a mock-up of his box art. So that's everything notable about Edward 2.0, so I guess it's time to give it a run on my layout. While this Edward is a huge improvement from before, if I'm being honest, it's not a perfect model. When I was printing the final parts, I was having issues with my printer, resulting in failed and shoddy looking parts. I had to simplify the design in some areas to get the best results, and even then, the parts still look rough. So there will likely be another revision of Edward when I finally upgrade my printer, but for now, I'm satisfied with what I have. You may have noticed that I didn't upgrade his troublesome van. That's because I didn't think it needed one. Edward was the model in dire need of a makeover, while the van held up remarkably well. That being said, I haven't ruled out remaking the van in the future. It'll be a bit longer before I get to Gordon, Henry, and Duck, as there is one more model I want to upgrade. My radio-controlled special letter Thomas. I've been wanting to redo his electronics for the longest time, as my first attempt, while functional, was a bit sloppy. I'll also be changing the overall aesthetic, stripping the special letter theme to turn it into the Strasbourg Railroad Thomas. So be looking forward to that later this year. I'll be posting updates about it on my Patreon. Speaking of, I want to give a shout out to my Patreon supporters, whose names are appearing on screen. Your support is very much appreciated, and it helps me fund projects like this. Patrons get the latest updates on all my projects, as well as early access and sneak peeks of new videos. If you're interested, it's only $5 a month, and the link is in the description. Anyway, that's where I'll end the video for today. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I thank you for watching. Alright guys, bye.